Nowadays, and quite sadly I think, a lot of people don't have much interaction with animals outside pigeons or house cats and maybe dogs. But in the Middle Ages, animals would have been a much larger part of everyone's lives. Today's guests, Spike Gibbs and Jordan Claridge, have been studying what happened when animals got out or got lost. And they're going to tell us about how the medieval period dealt with stray animals. Welcome to Future Imperfect. Welcome everybody to another edition of Future Imperfect. I have some very interesting guests. Jordan and Spike, you've co-authored a paper. Do you want to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about this? Because that's going to form the nexus around which we're going to have a chat, if that's all right.
Yeah, I'm Jordan Claridge. I'm an assistant professor at the London School of Economics.
And I'm Spike Gibbs. I'm a lecturer just down the road at King's College London in medieval history.
Fantastic. Very prestigious. I'm now feeling slightly intimidated because I've got experts on the other end of the microphone to me. But this paper is called Waifs and Strays, Property Rights in Late Medieval England. Is that correct?
It is.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that in the general terms, and then we'll sort of dig down into it a little bit?
Yeah, so this paper was a long time coming. I think the original idea for it came out of my PhD research, which is a book I've been working on for many years on the horse trade in late medieval England. And basically, I was trying to figure out where people got their agricultural horses from. And I kept seeing these recurring references to waifs or strays, sometimes vagabondis. And it's not an insignificant proportion of horses that come onto lords' farms via this kind of mysterious stray waif animals. And I was wondering, is this people recording wild animals that have appeared and have been captured, or is it something else? And then there's a second idea about the lords who own these farms end up owning these stray animals in a number of cases. So then it becomes an issue of property rights. You know, is this a case of lords expropriating the animals of the local village for their own gain? But the manorial accounts that I used didn't really have enough information to satisfactorily understand the system or answer these questions. And that's kind of where Spike comes in.
Yeah, so I started working at the London School of Economics after finishing my PhD. Jordan had just started as an assistant professor, but he'd been there for longer. And we knew each other a little bit before, but he kind of said, I'm interested in these stray horses specifically, but stray animals. And my background is in a slightly different kind of set of records. So you have these accounts which tell you about the kind of operations of lords' estates in terms of income and outgoing and making a profit. While I was interested in the courts, which are run by lords, but they're used by tenants. And they tell you about a very wide range of information about what's going on in the community. But one thing they tell you about is these stray animals. How do they appear? What happened to them? And we realized that between us, we kind of had both sides of this story, both pieces of the puzzle. And we decided to collaborate on it. And it took us a few years. The pandemic gave us a bit of time to work on it in a more focused way. And yeah, we wrote this paper and submitted it. We're very happy when it was accepted.
One of the things that in my studies medieval is we have words that we share with the medieval period, but often the words have very specific meanings in the medieval period, which might be slightly different to the way we understand it now. So for our modern audience, you're talking about waifs and strays. Is that the same? Are they just synonyms, or do they have subtle differences? And you used a third word as well. So it'd be fun to look into that.
Absolutely. So we chose Waifs and Strays as a title because it sounded quite good. But in reality, we really only look at strays. Waif property is property that's involved in a criminal act and falls to the lord because of that. So a stolen piece of property might be seen as a waif property, and therefore the lords could seize it because it was involved in a crime. Strays also fall to the lord, but it's a slightly different thing. They only fall to the lord if they're unclaimed for a year and a day, and we can talk a little bit more about that later. In terms of the actual terminology, they use a wide variety of words. Obviously, these records are in Latin, not English, so it doesn't quickly map on, but you see the word estray in English as well, stray. So they aren't synonyms, but the words map on pretty well to what we would think in English today.
Right, right. And what kind of creatures, specifically talking about horses? So are you talking about smaller ones that we might think of today? Again, people in the modern world often think of horses as these ginormous animals. And from my modest studies on war horses, for example, they're substantially smaller than you might expect. Are we talking about working size horses, ponies? Do we even know?
Short answer is yes, right? So there is a kind of two-sector equine economy in the Middle Ages. There's one for war horses or elite horses. It might include riding horses or hunting horses, but these are very expensive animals owned almost exclusively by the aristocracy. And then there's a group of much cheaper agricultural animals. I think with the exception of perhaps one animal that we encountered in this interesting case where two lords are arguing over who had the right to claim it as stray, all of the animals we're talking about here and the whole stray system itself is designed to return working horses and other agricultural livestock to their owners. So all of the recent archaeological research suggests that even war horses were pretty small animals by modern standards. And I think the agricultural horses are definitely lower value and might even be smaller yet in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, I mean, my personal experience of smaller horses, you got a 14-2 horse, which is technically a tall pony in modern parlance, can easily carry a man in armor and joust, which is a bit weird to think about it because everybody assumes that people will be riding these giant beasts, but that's a very modern phenomenon in my experience. So we're talking about more big pony-sized creatures, I guess. And do we have breeds as such? Do they describe the animals in terms of their color, what they look like, and that kind of stuff? Are we given that kind of detail?
So color, yes. I mean, there's a reference that we came across about a black and white spotted horse, which I think is what you would probably call piebald now.
Yep.
So they often describe the physical characteristics. There's another one that's described with a star on its forehead. So they describe the horse as best as they can so that the animal can be identified. Selective breeding of agricultural horses is very much an early modern phenomenon. So they don't really have any notion of, Shires or Suffolk punches or all of these famous breeds that you start to hear about basically after Henry VIII. So descriptors of physical characteristics, yes. Specific breeds, no.
Okay, so it would be a grey horse or a black horse with a white star. They wouldn't say it was particularly big or particularly hairy or with a big head or anything like that, do they?
No, not at all. The only thing they talk about is anything relevant to the value as well. So they might say if it was lame, there's not a horse, but a bull we found that is described as like insane, basically, which presumably reduces its value. There's a leprous pig, I think it is.
A leprous pig?
A leprous pig. Don't know quite what that means, obviously. So they talk about things like that to justify the low values that they ascribe to these animals.
Yeah.
So we think that these are, the strays, particularly that end up not being ever claimed, which is quite a high proportion, about 57% at one of the manors we looked at. We think they're the ones that people perhaps didn't expend much effort to get back, basically.
Right.
And therefore we're seeing very low value animals. And certainly the horses we looked at are valued at prices which are significantly smaller than the average price of agricultural horses in this period.
That's really interesting. So in some ways, you could argue that somebody had let them go because they didn't want to look after them anymore and sort of flung them out into the wild.
Yeah, this is something we don't address directly in this paper, but we have thought about a lot. And there's very little direct evidence to answer this question. But I think the initial hypothesis one would have is that these are valuable animals and people would want them. They were worth money. They could do work for you. Every other animal, aside from a horse, could provide secondary products. But the situation seems to be that there was a lot of people who weren't that concerned with getting them back. Part of this is, especially with horses, is the cost of maintaining them can be significant. And then another thing we thought of, which maybe you have a little bit more insight into as a person who works with horses, is that if you think about slaughtering a horse that doesn't have any value as meat, it's a difficult task if you're armed basically only with a knife.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's not totally unfeasible that somebody might say, let's just let this animal go, as opposed to trying to slaughter it. And I'm only going to get pennies for its hide at the end of the day. I mean, presumably some butchers would have dealt with this, but I mean, this is hard to prove, but the evidence kind of points towards something like that.
It's really interesting. So it could be just people letting horses that have now, they're literally negative value. You turf them out into the wilderness and they wander around and end up on somebody else's land.
And this is kind of where we get to in our meandering narrative of this paper, is that we think the stray system actually works to redistribute animals. So you think about, one person's garbage is another person's treasure. Perhaps, some old horse that wasn't really worth keeping for a more well-to-do peasant farmer might have found its way through the stray system to a poorer peasant who didn't have the kind of intense work requirements for it, but could maybe ride it back and forth to market for a few years. So we think of the stray system as this way that, like a centrifuge, that livestock gets redistributed from people who have no need for it to people who can make use of it.
And of course, identifying horses even today is actually quite difficult, which is why legally horses today have to be chipped. So you can identify them. I mean, on a horse passport, for those that don't know, every horse in England has to have a horse passport. And the vet will go around and identify notable features of the horse. So they might identify what's called whorls, which are in the coat. They're places where the hair kind of changes direction. And those are quite obvious. Often there's one on the forehead under a star, for example. But they often have components of whorls in different parts of the body. But sometimes you come across horses without much in the way of distinguishing features. And then it's actually, without a chip inside them, it's incredibly difficult to say that's the horse in the document. They drop down to the shape of the chestnuts, which is a kind of a horny feature on the inside of horses' front legs and back legs. They sometimes trace those to try and get the shape because they're quite different. But again, that requires interpretation. It's really fascinating. They had the same sort of problem. I wonder if people in the local area were going, shh, don't tell anybody, that's Dobbin I've just released into the wilderness, and everybody stay quiet because it's a Lord's problem now, okay? Just shut up.
Yeah, I think that's not an unreasonable guess to make. I mean, there's another mechanism aside from documenting the physical attributes or some behavior characteristics of an animal. It's kind of similar to this horse passport thing you're talking about, but the medieval equivalent is that they're often required to bring members of the community who will vouch to say, yes, this was John's horse.
Yeah, exactly. So obviously a lot of horses aren't claimed, but then quite a few are as well. We found about 30% at this manor of animals rather than horses, but were claimed. And what you do is you bring your neighbors with you from your community, because remember that these strays are being found in a neighboring community or up to 10 miles away, we found it could be, which is a long distance in the medieval world. And we found that they would bring these people who were called hands in the document with them, between about 3 and 12 people. And they would vouch that this was your horse. So they don't use physical identifiers in that way, or maybe they do, but there's not what's recorded in the document. Instead, it's all about the people. And that's true of lots of the parts of the medieval legal system, where being able to provide trustworthy witnesses, trustworthy men, and it is very male, I have to say, to prove that your animal belongs to you is very common.
Yes, so you had this concept of people vouching for your bona fides, which, of course, as we all know, can be a good thing, but it's horribly open to corruption, I guess. Yeah, just tell all your mates that this is definitely your horse because you want it back. So do we have a record of the cost of these stray animals? Is there a sort of an amount of damage they did? Is that recorded? And did somebody pay a fine? Or how did that work? When an animal escapes and causes mayhem, what's the situation?
Yeah, it's a bit of a complicated one. So we don't have much evidence about these specific stray animals causing damage. What we do have a lot of is evidence for instances where animals escaped, but the owner was known. So in the legal parlance of these records, they're not strays because it's probably an animal from someone who lives in their community. So everyone already knows, that's John's horse. And they will say John's horse damaged the lord's crops or the crops of another tenant. And then John will have to pay damages probably to the person whose land it is, but whoever's land it is, whether it's a tenant's land, whether it's a lord's land, the lord gets some consideration for this offence because it's both a public offence and a private offence because it's damaging someone else's property.
So you could almost look like it's compensation for the person damaged and then a fine on top of it to say, don't do this again, don't let your pig out and into my orchard or whatever it might be. Is that the sort of thing you imagine?
Exactly. That's entirely how it works. Although confusingly, they call them amercements because a fine in these records is permission to do something. So you pay a fine to like build a weir in the river or something like that. And an amercement is when you're in mercy to the Lord. And to get the Lord's mercy, you pay a small amount of money and then that's recompense for that.
That just shows you how language changes, doesn't it? The same word means something totally different
exactly.
a few hundred years later. So you have to be really careful when interpreting old documents for that reason.
Absolutely.
That literally paying a fine means something totally different.
It's something I always forget to mention to my undergraduate students until they turn up one day very, very confused, having read some of these documents that we've set them. And then I say, oh, yes. A fine doesn't actually mean a fine. It's not like a parking ticket. It's a permission to do something.
And it also shows you how much assumed knowledge goes along with using certain words by an audience. So when we're looking at the past, we have to sort of almost unpack our own misunderstandings sometimes of what words mean, because there's a classic example of something having so many other peripheral meanings. You know, we think of a fine today as you're punished for something because you've done something wrong. And here it's exactly the opposite. You're gaining something, given permission to do it. So you're doing the right thing.
Absolutely. And it is very important. So when we first did kind of the work on this, I worked on one set of court records and I wrote down horse for all these different Latin translations. And Jordan was horrified and I had to go back because they all meant slightly different things. And that was very important. But for me, I was like, oh, the dictionary just says horse. Fine, I'll just write horse. So it just goes to show.
Yes, you can overinterpret and underinterpret words, can't you? And then you miss a lot of subtleties. Sometimes you get things that get glossed over in the records, I think. You know, people say everybody knows this, so we're not going to write about it. And in fact, everybody's forgotten it now, so we don't know what they're actually talking about.
Absolutely. You were talking about this identifying of animals. I'm sure there was a process where these witnesses would point out certain physical characteristics, but the record doesn't really care about that because what it really is there for is to identify who the owner is, not the process by how that was arranged.
Yeah, and these are court records, so these are sort of working documents, aren't they, of the system. They're not writing them with a view to it being read in a few hundred years and interpreted. They're literally working documents for today or tomorrow or the next week.
Indeed.
Cool. Right. So an animal might be stray, be on a lord's land. Nobody claims it. Whose responsibility is it? Because you can't just have it wandering around willy-nilly. So does it become the lord's responsibility? And is that a cost to the lord then?
Yeah, I guess there's two parts to this story. So I might start with the legal process and then Jordan might tell you a little bit more about the cost side of this.
Cool.
So there's two things that can happen. There's what should happen and what sometimes happens when people don't choose to follow the rules. But what should happen is if you find a stray animal, you secure it, first of all, because you don't want it to go around damaging more of the crops. And remember that a lot of these villages have these open fields. You know, they're not enclosed kind of pieces of land. So an animal could damage lots of people's crops in a small amount of time. So it's a kind of collective good there that needs to be solved. Once the animal is secured, the person should bring it to the next session of the manor court and report that this stray has been found, and then it will be valued as well, so the Lord knows it exists and what value it has. And we see that this valuation is important because then if the animal dies due to the negligence of someone on the manor, the Lord often gets recompense for that. So, you know, if a stray cow then dies, the Lord might get some money back. What does sometimes happen is people decide not to report the animal and then try and profit from them themselves, not to try and get it back to its original owner. And we have quite a nice example where at the manor of Little Downham, which is in Cambridgeshire, just outside Ely, a local official called a reeve was found to have actually sold not the horse that appeared to stray, but a foal it gave birth to. So kind of trying to get round this through that. Obviously, we should say that we only know the case is right when the person was found out, basically. So This could have been very, very rampant and we would never know because obviously it doesn't appear in the records.
That's interesting. It's an interesting point, though. If it's a stray animal and it gives birth on your land, I guess there's now two strays. That would be an interesting one for the courts to work out. What did they decide in that case? Is that they were both owned by the Lord?
They were both owned by the Lord. Unfortunately, we don't have any cases where someone claimed an animal and then the young of that animal. In the records we looked at, there might be one out there. There are hundreds and, well, there's actually thousands, tens of thousands of these court records that still exist for medieval England. And we obviously looked at a tiny fraction of those. But maybe, Jordan, you could tell us a little bit about what happened next and the costs of this system.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a more complicated system than we actually anticipated, I think, when we embarked on this process. We actually had to sit down and draw a flow chart to try to understand all of the parameters involved in what happens between when the horse is found as stray or any other animal is found as stray and when it gets returned to its owner. And I mean, if you check out the article, you can look at the flow chart. It's probably more complicated than you imagine. But basically, then the manor court values it and they say, okay, we have this horse or this pig or this, cow, whatever. We think it's worth this much. And this is important because it's effectively a binding amount. So if the animal goes unclaimed for a year and a day, and that's, set in the codified laws, basically, it becomes the Lord's property. And then the Lord could either use it himself or he could sell it. And when they sell it, it has to be sold for the value at which was set when it originally arrived. And prices for horses and other livestock are actually hard to come by in the Middle Ages. So some of the valuations of these stray animals are actually a significant seam of evidence to try to understand what the value of peasant horses or peasant livestock were actually worth. And we find that they tend to be quite low.
Well, by low, how much do you mean? I know money is very difficult to sort of explain in medieval times, but in terms of, the wage a man might earn as a labourer, an ordinary person, is it a week's worth of work or less?
More, I think, in some cases, less in others.
Okay.
So you're dealing with a range, in most cases, below 50 pence.
Right.
And that is about 4 shillings. So to put it in a bit of perspective, a construction worker is going to earn between 1 and 4 pence per day. So it's, an animal that's worth several days' work for a skilled laborer, but it's not a fortune.
Yeah, so it's useful for our listener to sort of imagine what it's worth. So you're talking about, a week's wages roughly, which is, not nothing, but not a huge amount.
A week's wages for a pretty well-paid and skilled person. If you were a plowman, it would be, some weeks of work.
Okay. So whilst they're cheap, they're not throwaway amounts of money. These are substantial amounts of money for ordinary people of modest means at the time, so it's not sort of 20p in modern terms. It's not throwaway. It's not a packet of crisps.
No, absolutely not. They are very valuable. They're probably, after the actual land holding, if you imagine the peasant doesn't own that, obviously, but they pay a rent to it. It's their most valuable thing. But they're probably one of the most important kind of inputs in agriculture after that, right, Jordan? I think Jordan's the expert on this, so that's why I'm deferring to him a little bit.
Okay.
So as we pointed out, this isn't the value of an agricultural horse. It's just the value assigned to a stray agricultural horse. And we're not sure exactly why these prices are so much lower than the average value of an agricultural horse. Is it because of the things we talked about earlier, where they're low quality, they've been let go because they're already quite old, they have diseases? Or is it that when peasant juries, who actually are the ones who determine the values, not the Lord, know that this animal after the 366 days is going to come up for purchase, let's keep that value relatively low, they're thinking, so that one of us can buy it.
Yes.
We don't know which of those it is. There's no way we can know. Probably a little bit of both together.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the animal comes in, it gets valued, and then it has to be proclaimed, right?
Yeah. So you have to go and basically make clear that this animal has appeared. And obviously it doesn't belong to someone in the local community, right? Because otherwise you wouldn't need this stray system. The person would have just got it.
Yeah.
So what they do instead is they will order it to be advertised in local places where people congregate. So we have references, for instance, to churches on a Sunday. We have references to marketplaces, local fairs. So places where, there'll be lots of people coming to sell their produce, to engage with the religious service. And there, if you've lost your animal, you might be on the lookout to hear that it's been found in a local place.
So not a notice board, because I doubt they would actually put notices up as such. Or did they? Was it by word of mouth? Was it by proclamation?
It's a good question. I would assume it's not something they would devote scarce resources of parchment and ink to, but they definitely say it should be proclaimed. We've encountered cases where a group of stray animals are found and the owners kind of slowly creep out of the woodwork, but some remain unclaimed, and the court keeps saying, no, go back, proclaim them again.
Right.
How the proclaiming actually works, I'm not sure. Somebody who is more in tune with everyday village life might. I don't think it's a notice pinned to the church door, but something close to it, whatever the medieval analog is.
Because I was thinking, because a lot of our listeners play fantasy role-playing games as well. And of course, the trope of having missions, as it were, or quests sort of pinned to the notice board in the local village is a bit of a trope in computer games and in tabletop role-playing games. So to discover that there actually was a process of alerting the local community at a certain time in a certain place is actually wonderful. So it may have been as simple as somebody reads it out after the service, and just before everybody goes, it's like, we have some notices, we have some proclamations to make, and we'll just say those at the same time so that everybody hears it. That's a possibility. But I do love the idea of notice boards, but I think you're right. I think that the cost of that would have been prohibitive.
And obviously, most of these people were not literate, so couldn't have read the notice board. But the Crown is very good at transferring information to local communities as well in this period. And it's not something we probably should talk about too much because we're not experts, but news on the war in France in the 14th century seems to be getting down to a very, very kind of normal person. These big affairs of state often happening a long way away. The information is deliberately transferred to the local population. Obviously, not in an unvarnished way, but we can see that communications shouldn't be underestimated in medieval England. It is quite an integrated society in that way.
It would be fascinating to find that out. I mean, it could be just rumor and people gossiping, because that's what they did. They talked about things, but it sounds to me like there were at least some systems for kind of more official dissemination of information.
Yeah.
And it would make sense for it to be where people gathered, because that was the most efficient way of doing it. So I think that's fascinating.
It's important to note that any stray animal that goes unclaimed for 366 days reverts to the ownership of the lord in whose domain it was found. But if the lord is found to have not proclaimed the animal as they should have in the neighboring villages, they can lose their right to claim it, right? Lords can be found negligent for not having proclaimed it adequately.
So again, a lot of people have this myth that sort of lords were all powerful and could abuse and destroy people at will. And it's very clearly not the case. They had rules they had to follow as well. And it's fascinating if one of the lords did something wrong and the ordinary people went, no, you've made a mess up here. You haven't honestly declared it. I mean, it seems like the system is genuinely trying to find the owner of the animal within a certain sensible time period, and then having to make decisions like the law does today about what to do when there's a default. What happens if nobody's come forward? Okay, we have to make decisions, but we also have to have rules about how those decisions get made.
Yeah, and this is where we kind of came to with this piece. And we approached it as a good historian, a good group of historians should, in saying, we have no priors here. We want to try to understand how this worked. And then once we got a sense of how we thought it worked, understanding why it worked in the way it did. And this is why we think that this is a good case of lords and tenants, or lords and the communities they governed, really cooperating in a meaningful way, right? There's a long history of interpreting lord-tenant relationships as antagonistic, in that they were constantly in conflict with each other, and the incentives for both groups were always at odds. We find this case maybe suggests something slightly different, in that everybody's concerned about keeping livestock off of the land, so damage to the arable crops isn't done. Most tenants are probably interested in reclaiming some of their livestock that escapes, or at least having the option to reclaim it if they think the animal is valuable enough. So we think that this is an instance of cooperation because the lords couldn't profit in any meaningful way. In many cases, it probably cost them money to administer this stray system. So we think the lords and their community are cooperating in this instance to collectively provide what economists would call a public good, to ensure that there's a way, a transparent way for members of the community to reclaim lost capital assets in livestock, a way for the lord to ensure that unrequired damage isn't being done to the community. And yeah, maybe you want to add something, Spike.
Yeah, absolutely. So it just generally speaks to the fact that, as you say, lords are not able to act kind of arbitrarily to their tenants. Both partners in this system believe in this kind of custom and these customary expectations, this culture of good lordship. And that really kind of suggests that lords and tenants are able to collaborate a lot of the time. I'm not saying, and I don't think either of us would say, then this relationship never breaks down. The Peasants' Revolt shows that at least some tenants are not happy with their lords at certain points, but it's a far more flexible system than this idea of constant antagonism between two classes.
Yeah, and very much less like the Hollywood system of rapacious lords going around doing whatever they wanted and peasants being completely downtrodden. I mean, again, I'm not suggesting that they were equal in any way, but there does seem to have been a fairly well-established, in this specific case, a fairly well-established process by which a problem that the community had, and high and low, was solved. And if people didn't follow the rules, they got into trouble. Both parties potentially got into trouble. So that's really interesting. What about these courts, though? You mentioned you had to look after the animal until the court happened. How often were they coming along? Because I'm now having this idea that you might have to look after that animal for 3 months. And then suddenly you don't end up owning it anyway, but somehow it's your responsibility.
Absolutely. So it really varies. The ideal in some of the records is that a court should be held every 3 weeks. On some manors, this does happen. For instance, the Manor of Wakefield, one that we studied, has a court every 3 weeks. But far more typical, particularly by the late Middle Ages, was perhaps once every 3 months, 4 times a year. So you could be looking after these animals for quite long periods of time. And actually, once the animal is brought to the court, sometimes it's passed off to an official of the lord who will then look after the animal for that period of time. But in other cases, the animal is directly transferred to a tenant, a peasant living in the community. Might be the person who found it or someone else. It can be either, who then might actually look after it for the rest of that time period, unless it's claimed. And if it isn't claimed, they're often sold the animal at the end. So effectively, ownership is already sort of being transferred to someone who will use the animal productively rather than the lord who might not have much use of it, to kind of preempt some of these costs. So our model thought about what it would have cost the lord to look after a stray horse for this period, but we actually think a lot of the time lords don't want these animals, so they transfer it to someone who would use it in the community. It's back to this kind of recirculation idea we were talking about.
I have this idea of the Reeve or something going around going, will somebody look after this bloody stray horse for me, please? And everybody going, no, sorry, I'm too busy, I can't afford it. And finally finding somebody that goes, all right, look, if it's a sensible price, what price are we putting on it? I'll look after it. And then I need a replacement horse, or I'll have a second one or something. Or somebody twisting somebody's arm to take another horse, another animal.
Absolutely. And that's another reason why these valuations might be so low, because that's the only way to sort of recompense the person who's had to look after the animal before they can officially buy it after those 366-day period.
Yeah, so there's a discount price because you've already been looking after it for 2 months. And we know that's a burden to people that don't have much spare cash. That's really interesting. I love that.
I like the idea of the Reeve going around saying, well, nobody rid me of this troublesome bull. Yeah, it's quite interesting. And again, I think this returns to our idea the mechanism works quite well, even if it's not the intended outcome of the system in general. It works to distribute livestock from people who maybe didn't want it to people who can use it, because the person who ultimately comes forward and takes the animal, you can't force them to do it, or at least the records don't suggest that anybody could be compelled to do it. So you're getting somebody who's going to find some way to make use of the animal. And of course, horses are the case study that we explore because they were the most common stray animal and the types and varieties are known. They're an interesting case in this scenario we're talking about relative to other forms of livestock because they could do work for you, right? And how one values that work is very difficult to calculate. So if the peasant who comes forward and says, I'll take care of this horse, and then they're riding it back and forth to market every week, that has a value. It's hard to pin a number to that value, but that might be what incentivizes somebody to take it off the Lord's hands. The Lord has a problem because he's the great institutional agriculturalist of the time. So he has 8 plow horses. He doesn't need another one. And he, doesn't want to be bothered with it. Whereas there's more flexibility in the peasant world, I think.
And I suppose there's a certain amount of status, as social status. You've got a new horse. You didn't have a horse before. Now you've got a horse from this system. So you've sort of moved up a notch. It might not be a dramatic horse. It might not be a particularly top range horse at all, but it is still a horse. It's like having a car or not having a car. It makes a difference.
Yeah. And I mean, the real advantage of horses is their flexibility, right? They can be used for draft power. They can pull a wagon or a plow. They can be ridden. They can be used as a pack animal. So there's a whole range of uses that you can put them to. Whereas an ox, it's either going to pull a plow or travel very slowly on the road, or it has to be slaughtered to be eaten.
So horses are more flexible in that way. I mean, do we know whether the horses were broken to ride? Is there any indication in the records of the sort of skills that the horse might have, or is that just glossed over?
I mean, this is something we know very, very little about, the training of agricultural animals. We would assume that most of the animals that we encounter in the records, if they're adult animals, have been broken and were being used on somebody's farm. And younger ones may not have been broken yet. You have references to unweaned foals that appear as stray at some point, probably to the distress of the foal and the mother. But we don't know actually that much about the process of training these animals.
Yeah, it's actually not very difficult with a horse with the right attitude. In a few days, you can get on its back. It might not be very good at doing it. I've backed many horses myself. But if the horse has got a fairly good attitude and it's used to people, you can do a lot of things with it, especially if you're calm and collected with it. So, even if you don't know what it can do, you could probably find out in a few days whether it actually can be ridden or whether it could be packed or whatever.
Yeah, one of the other differentiations we see in the documents is a difference between an affer or a stot, which is, often understood as a plow horse, but it's probably more of an all-purpose animal, or a cart horse, Equus caractarius, a very specific animal. And cart horses are worth significantly more than plow horses.
Oh.
And what justifies the price premium is either going to be strength, but increasingly, I think, it's about temperament, as you discuss, in that if your badly behaved horse is badly behaved while it's plowing a field, stakes are low. If you're pulling, a ton of grain to the market that you're hoping to sell so your family can survive the winter, and you have an uncooperative or spooky cart horse that dumps your grain in the road, that's a bigger problem.
Also, some horses are valued because of fashion sometimes, because of the way they look. Certainly today may have been a component of it, fancy colour or an unusual colour or it looking nice may have added value. I think in the higher status horses, that was probably a component of them.
Yeah, certainly for elite horses. I mean, I don't know if the black and white spotted horse was valued higher than the average. We could check.
We didn't look at it systematically, unfortunately. Maybe we should have done.
Fancy colours, fancy coloured horses, yeah. Was there anything else you wanted to sort of say about observations? We've done a very quick whiz through that wonderful snapshot of a small piece of medieval social interaction. Was there anything I've missed out that you want to sort of bring to our attention?
Well, I mean, where have we gotten through with our flow chart here?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Once the animal has been held or it's been agreed who's going to take for it, then basically somebody either has to claim it or not. The owner has to come forward with his pledges to claim it. He has to pay a fine, usually a small amount of money, in order to have the animal lawfully returned to him. Otherwise, it gets forfeit to the Lord, and the Lord either sells it, probably to the local community, or if it's a high enough quality animal, adds it to his own demesne stock, which for horses would mean working. For any of the other animals, it would almost certainly mean, slaughtering. There's a fantastic example for a black bull, which was very, very valuable, 9 shillings, 6 pence, was slaughtered for the hospitality of the Lord at the rural retreat of the Bishop of Ely.
And one thing we should mention is about just how effective this system is, or at least how securely it ensures the rights of those who lose animals, is that even if you get your hands to come and say it's your animal, you also have to have pledges who also agree to pay the value of that animal. If a second claimant turns up and it's actually found the first claimant was lying. So you talked about the kind of maybe ability for dishonesty in the system, but they did try and at least mitigate for that a little bit. I don't know how they would decide if there were 2 claimants who was correct, but they at least have thought about this problem.
Right. And if they thought about it, it happened. So, there's no point having rules unless you have a problem to solve with that rule. So, that's interesting. So even after you've gone through the year and a day, it's following the system. Somebody can turn up later and say, hang on, this has all gone wrong.
Only within the year and the day still.
So year and the day is a sort of like statute of limitations.
Absolutely.
Right.
And you see that throughout medieval England. There's lots of other things where a year and a day is normally the amount of time. So famously, if a serf flees to a town and they stay for a year and a day, they're then free. That doesn't really happen very often, we don't think, but in theory, that's true.
In theory, it's there.
Yeah.
Is there a reason for a year and a day? Is it biblical or is it poetic? Because it's a great timeline, I think. It sounds brilliant.
Fantastic question. I don't know the answer. I'm not sure if Jordan knows the answer. I'm sure there is an answer, but we're not sure.
I wonder if anybody does know. But it might be that it had to be at least a year. So if you said a year and a day, you're definitely sure that it's more than a year. I mean, law is like that sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's interesting. You get these wonderful conceptions of time. Year and a day is one. There's also the concept of time out of mind or within living memory, which is another kind of time frame that you get people referring to again and again in these documents.
It wasn't the time immemorial one. Isn't that from things like monastic rites, for example, where they're trying to prove who owned which field and then the monks find a piece of parchment that says, from time immemorial, we've owned this land.
Absolutely. And also in this kind of oral legal system that these peasants have in these courts, often they'll justify something as customary from being out of living mind. That's quite common. So no one remembers it being different. So therefore, it must have always been this way.
Right.
It's quite a common thing because obviously not everything is written down in this period.
Wonderful. Well, look, we could probably have a talk about that, but that's a whole other subject. I love medieval measurements of time and weight and distance, chains and furlongs, and it's all brilliant, but it's all very specific to the job you're trying to measure. But anyway, we'll come on to that in another chat. But gentlemen, thank you very much. Sounds absolutely fascinating. So the paper is Wastes and Strays, Property Rights in Late Medieval England. How do people find it if they want to read it?
If you Google that, you'll find it. If you add Journal of British Studies, you'll definitely find it. It's open access. It's not behind a paywall. You can just download the PDF and read away.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Before we go, is there anything you guys want to add? If people want to follow your work, do you have, places they can find your work?
I think if you Google Jordan Claridge or Spike Gibbs, you'll be directed to our respective web pages.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. That little insight into how organised the medieval system actually could be sometimes, albeit a little bit sort of strange around the edges. I think it's a really interesting insight into how they dealt with problems that were material and mattered to them.
Absolutely.
Indeed. Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.